I think we got the wrong idea of scale. We think of scale like do one thing and hopefully it'll work for everyone with the variation automated. The alternative is that we instead scale the creation of locally responsive solutions. That instead of taking one thing and blowing it up to work for everyone, we make it scalable to create lots of little things. The real innovators, it's the folks who look around them and say, wow, what if instead this worked differently? And instead of having to say, wow, I wish the powers that be would do that, they actually get to work, find collaborators, use a step-by-step process, and draw resources to their projects. If you're doing something you don't believe in, then every day is a drag. But if you're doing something you do believe in, then it can be incredibly hard for incredibly long. But every day is a little bit of a thrill. Maybe not every day, but a lot of them.
Welcome back to the Plucky Bamboo Podcast, where we get into the real stories and strategies behind scaling sustainability-focused businesses. Today, I'm joined by Alejandro Crawford, co-founder of RebelBase and co-author of One Size Fits None, a book and platform built around a powerful and pretty common sense idea that the best solutions don't come from the top down, but from the people closest to the problem. In this episode, we dig into the deeper systems that shape and often sabotage sustainability innovation, like why the traditional model of scale is broken and what we should be scaling instead, how founders lose their flexibility and why that kills their ability to experiment, and what really happens when you try and sell into universities, governments, or large corporates, and how to navigate that broken process. If you've ever felt like you're building in a system that wasn't designed for you, this conversation will hit home in a lot of ways. Let's get into it. Alejandro, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and RebelBase?
Chris, it's a pleasure to be here. The idea was germinated in a demo day in East Harlem, which is a neighborhood in New York City, where I had created a nonprofit program co-created with colleagues, where we were bringing entrepreneurs into classrooms in rough neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. And at the end of this demo day, we had teachers coming up and saying, this has been transformative. Students, these were teenagers, coming up to us and saying, I realize now that I can create a solution. I don't just need to plug into something that I don't believe in. And it was all very exciting. And we went to dinner afterwards, the other founders of this and I. And we had this strange deflation, Chris, where the excitement started to dissipate. And it hit us that we had been in those classrooms sometimes 3 days a week together, and that everything we just achieved that we were proud of was unsustainable and the furthest thing from scalable. So we had a real moment and we said, you know what we need to do? We need to create tools, any organization, anywhere in the world, to do just this. And that became the RebelBase platform, which is, it's not what you would think of as just a lot of proprietary tools. Instead, it's a place where experts build these guided, we call them builders, that guide an innovator, an entrepreneur, a change maker through something they're going to need to know how to do. Where the big idea is, you don't have to go, do an MBA or something to be able to answer the business questions. You don't have to find a financial guru a financial expert simply for you to be able to project what you can achieve. You don't need to talk to someone who's an expert in creating logic models to tell you your theory of change. Just go on RebelBase, and as users like to say, it'll walk you through step by step, and you'll come out the other side with something to show for yourself. That having been said, this toolkit is only part of what we're doing. And when I say only, I mean, it's not the tools, it's the way folks are using them. We've had the privilege of people using these tools in their communities, from the townships of South Africa to a university in exile, in Belarusian university in exile. And these facilitators are the real innovators. And I'm going to take that a step further, actually. The facilitators have learned to step folks through creating experiments of their own. And the striking insight this has shown us is that the more you experiment, the better you get at it, and the more experiments then become ripple effects from what you're doing, and that this is something that can be normal, that regular people can do and participate, which leads me to the fallacy in what I've said so far. It's not even those facilitators who are the real innovators. It's the end users. It's the folks who look around them and say, wow, what if instead this worked differently? And instead of having to say, wow, I wish the powers that be would do that, they actually get to work, find collaborators, use a step-by-step process, and draw resources to their projects. And even if the first, the second, or the third doesn't pan out, that's the nature of an experiment. What our research all around the world has shown is that it changes people and turns them into, or finds the potential already resident in them to create a world that is sustainable, systems that respond to our needs, and the kinds of ownership that allow the local creation of what for too long we thought had to be imported or received from the top down.
What makes RebelBase different from like a typical incubator or course?
That's beginning of the story when I talked about that demo day. That was a typical incubator or a course. And in fact, I was involved in the creation of what became New York City's biggest tech incubator. In fact, it's run by a former student of mine. I had created them for universities and communities, and incubators have value. They provide space, right? Not everybody can have the one-car garage that Hewlett and Packard had, right? So the incubator, especially when real estate has become impossible in a place like London or Shanghai or New York, the incubator helps solve that problem, and the better ones sort of wrap you in some supports. Great. The problem is, all over the world, there are people who need this process who either don't have an incubator or have the kind that's just space. And what RebelBase has created is really a plug and play. And by the way, it's not space oriented. It's used physically, but it's also used virtually all over the world. So that I mentioned in passing StreetBiz, which is Nico de Klerk's program. Nico's the founder, but it's a program run by a bunch of people who call themselves the Nelsons. It's the Be a Nelson movement in South Africa. That's not a place. We had this fall folks who were coming in. They would go to a place to get broadband, to get on the platform. They'd go back into the field and conduct their experiments. And these are folks who are really rethinking the way things can work. These are the leaders. And do they need some fancy tech incubator like the one I was just talking about in New York? No, they don't. And in fact, if we assume that you do, it's game over and we've accomplished nothing, because one thing can be said for sure. We will not achieve a regenerative economy. We will not achieve an economy that really responds to our needs. We will stop thriving as we're doing as a civilization if we assume that the geniuses, the usual suspects, the folks who get brought to Silicon Valley after they're innovating in Philadelphia, that's Andrew Young's story, if we assume that they're the folks who will shape the future. It's the opposite. The people who know best the problems we need to solve are on the ground in their industries and their communities, seeing what doesn't work, and they know so much more about it than you or I do. That's what we're doing. So it doesn't really matter. It's not about some fancy algorithm that we are trading on. It's more, we've created a place where three things happen. One, you get those steps that I mentioned. So it's not a mystery. Two, it's often used in a cohort or a competitive environment. So you get a community that works with you to iterate on what you've done, because you always start out wrong. It's experimental, right? And then thirdly, it allows you, as you develop this, to draw resources and supports, right? Not just financial resources, but human and natural and other resources to what you're doing, because that's what innovation and entrepreneurship demands.
I'm curious to hear from you what you think most people get wrong about how change really happens at scale.
Well, I think we got the wrong idea of scale. We think of scale like do one thing, right? It's like the old, the model, I call it, try to make everything work like software. Do one thing. And then as much as possible, is why our book, Miriam Plavin Masterman and I have a book called One Size Fits None, Time for an Entrepreneurial Revolution, which is being published in October. And the reason we gave it that title is that the kinds of models that the hunt for a hockey stick, right? Returns that go through the roof up and to the right, and the desire for flywheel effects, right? Something you do once, and then Facebook can serve billions of people with, whatever it is, tens of thousands of employees. I think I got those dimensions right of those numbers. That works because Facebook's people aren't doing the work. And we started to dream, Chris, and by we, I mean investors, started to want everything to work that way. And as soon as you want everything to be that kind of scalable, you have a global food industry that's destroying the top soil, destroying local farmers, as Trevor Vaughn and Hunter Buffington described in a recent episode of What If Instead, the podcast I host. You have a health industry where you have more and more buy-up of hospital systems so that your actual need, the thing that you might be specific to your situation, there's no response to that because we've squeezed all the value out of that limit. So when I say there could be another kind of scale, what I mean is that stuff doesn't have to scale in this way where you do one thing once and hopefully it'll work for everyone with the variation automated. The alternative is that we instead scale the creation of locally responsive solutions. That instead of taking one thing and blowing it up to work for everyone, we make it scalable to create lots of little things. Some of them will grow. That's fine. That's good. But lots of things that grow to the size of their responsiveness. In the book, the economist Moose Schumann talks about diseconomies of scale, how economies of scale should mean that we do things at the right scale, right? Some things merit a bigger, more widespread solution than others that should be done very small. And so we've missed when an investor says to an entrepreneur, but can it scale? That investor is asking the wrong question. Now, entrepreneurs, I often talk about this with entrepreneurs I coach and students. How do you deal with that? I'm not saying look at the VC and say, you're asking the wrong question. But there's a way to say, well, I appreciate your asking that, and then show how you are going to create something that is more responsive to the users in your environment, right? That actually seizes an opportunity in the ecosystem, though, because the typical answer to that question is it's an answer that you can watch their eyes glaze over because they've heard it before. And you need to stand out a little bit. So show how you have something that when it replicates, it can be responsive to the specifics in ways that are hard to imitate. That's where I think the future interest is. Now, I'm saying this mindful that so much of the only thing that saved VC in 2024, meaning that made us have a decent amount of venture capital investment, was AI. Without AI, it was another horrific year like 2023. I'm mindful that so many entrepreneurs are being led in the opposite direction. They're being led to say, show us that because you're using some large language model in your startup, and many entrepreneurs are bolting that on right now, that you are going to be able to just work with that API and respond to everyone without doing something new. I would pose a caution, and Mim Plavin Masterman and I get into real depth about this in the book, which is to say that, first of all, there's nothing wrong with having answers about how you'll use LLMs. They're tools that have a lot of power, but be very careful not to assume that those answers are going to get you very far. You heard it here. Folks are watching this in 2026, for example, and we haven't seen various kinds of shakeout in that. I would be blown away, because the more you have one person working with automation to address needs that 100 people were addressing before, the more what they're creating will seem great. It'll be like, wow, it answered all the questions. I didn't have to do anything. But it will fail to respond to the needs. It will fail to respond to our needs. Now those models will gain currency where there's lots of market power, right? Where there's industry consolidation, so it's an only game in town. So folks have to accept it. But you're going to see a backlash. I strongly believe from users and customers to say, wait a minute, this isn't actually addressing. And I'm talking across industries, whether it's the legal advice you're getting, the syllabus your professor made, what's written on the packaging of your electronic product, the code that's written. You're going to have so much junk coming out there. And when I say unresponsive, MIMS and my coining of that concept in the book is to say, it doesn't actually get what you in your situation as a user want and need. So you end up experiencing a more and more frustrating outcome. And in many industries, we're forced. We get used to the frustration, but that's opportunity for entrepreneurs who want to say, wait a minute, sure, I'm going to use the best tech out there, but I'm also going to make sure that it's not giving you a generic or just a slipshod response that fails to address what you're doing. There will be so much opportunity there, if I'm right.
People tend to forget the survivorship bias is a thing. So just because something works for one company doesn't mean it'll work for everyone else. And I think, obviously I can't speak for all investors, but I think it's very easy to get stuck in this thing where you see something work really well for one investor and then everyone else wants to jump on board that train because they've seen that money be made. But actually they just have first move advantage. And then there's probably lots of others that just fell by the wayside because they didn't survive.
Can I just interject? Like, if you look at the history of waves of tech booms, right? And it is often driven by a hot, trendy technology. Look at all the companies that, I mean, look, there a lot of creative destruction involves lots of failures, right? But look at all the ones that never had a shot because they were imitated, because they were jumping on, Bitcoin craze, or they were jumping on the social media craze and is already done, if you're doing something really interesting and different, cool.
The AI grayness thing. So I mean, I use AI tools myself, but the more I see it being taken on by people, the more I see that everything is almost grey. Like there's a greyness coming through it all because obviously AI is trained all on the same data set. And so it just becomes an amalgam of all those things. Part of the reason I started this podcast is because before this, I wrote a white paper by interviewing lots of sustainability founders. And what I found is that there's 65 different stories there, and I can't get 65 stories into this white paper. All I can do is look at the trends, the shared challenges, and put those in. And so I completely agree with you there. I think what's going to happen is people realize that their needs aren't met as well by AI than they are by a human. I think there will be a backlash because people will realize there isn't a human at the end of this that cares about me. It's just another tech tool. And I think in person is going to become more important over the next couple of years. I believe less people will use the internet and communicate over it. But that's my belief.
I love where you're going. I want to talk about gray a little more. But before we do, I'm sure you've interviewed folks who do market research and talk about what delights the customer. You use this great field. What made you feel as if the company cared about you? Like these are not, warm, friendly ideas that you and I are making up, right? Like spend a little time doing user or market research and you will find that folks want delight, right? They want to feel like folks knew them and responded to them, right? And sure, you can create a menu. And now I'm using the metaphor of a food menu, not a computer menu, where all the food is bland, right? And folks can get used to bland. We know this is true. Every time you have one size fits none solutions from the Soviet Union to the current United States, which is most industries are oligopolies, like dominated by a few huge firms, which might as well be the Soviet government, right? As soon as you have this happen, you get gray. Right. And it's not to say that there aren't things that should be globally scaled. Of course there are, but which things? Now, let's talk about the place for gray. There's a series of interviews that Mimplaven Masterman and I have done with Adam Bulakowski of IPCG. It's a consulting firm that focuses on innovation with their clients. And we had this fascinating conversation, Chris, about in consulting, the client does not want the gray, not paying you for gray, right? Okay, just you live and die by your ability to give them an aha, to give them an insight that they didn't have otherwise. And we can criticize big consulting, but I'm talking boutique consulting, where you're not able to trade on your fancy name. You actually have to deliver it, right? Now,
Have to do some work. Yeah.
You have to do it, right? And what we get into that I'm fascinated by is that there are wonderful places where an LLM is an incredible tool, right? I use them also. but it's a question of where you use it. And we get into this metaphor of delegation. So Adam says, do you even know what the prompt should be? Do you know the right question to ask? Do you have the background to watch his videos? But I want to emphasize this idea of delegation. So 100 years ago, actually probably in the 80s, a guy called Bill Onken developed these 5 levels of delegation that you're probably familiar with. So if you're delegating to an entry-level employee, you want some things that they just do it. You just tell them, they do it, you never look at it, right? I'm not going to do all 5 to be for the sake. You want some things that you have to know they did it. You want some things where you actually want to look at it and then they run with it. And then you want some things where you have director's cut on everything. So the same should be true with our use of these LLMs, and more so, right? So if I'm using Perplexity or Anthropic and I'm asking a question, so what are phenomenal at is synthesis. It can look at thousands of sources. They're also really great at coming up with appropriateness. And by appropriateness, I'm actually ignoring increasing levels of hallucination when I say this. But if English is not your first language and you want to write a difficult to write email, it'll come up with this horribly euphemistic ways of saying politely this harsh thing you want to say, right? So there's things that are very good at. The key is going to be, as we get better at this, deciding where it's a really sensitive result and it needs to be redone versus where we can take it wholesale because it didn't matter at all, right? What we need to get good at is, like any powerful tool, figuring out where that's useful, right? We need to be very conscious in this moment where we're on a podcast that focuses on sustainability. We need to be very conscious of the costs of using these tools, which are currently rampant externalities, the water, the energy. We're just kind of assuming all that in because it seems free. It's not going to be free, right? I mean, to an end user of many kinds, consumers and so forth. And we need to be aware of where we started, you and I, which is there are things where we want something more specific. So in a nutshell, just like an entry-level employee you're working with, use these things in ways that make you better at what you're doing. In the book, we call that using it as an effective exoskeleton and being very careful about what you let atrophy as opposed to a substitute.
I'm interested to hear more about your work with large organizations because you've worked with things like universities, nonprofits, corporates, all that kind of thing. What's been the hardest part of getting those larger institutions to adopt something new? A lot of the people I speak with and a lot of people on this podcast obviously sort of selling into enterprises and things like that. So I think there might be learnings here that's transferable to that.
So we're in a moment now where our success in creating large bureaucratic organizations that dominate markets and dominate industries and dominate societies has been too great. And it's been too great for reasons that folks in our book, we call this life in cattle class. Folks experiencing life in cattle class, right? It's like that horrible experience you'll have on an airplane when you get the cheap seats, right? Folks experiencing life in cattle class are doing that largely because a large organization, a government or a company typically has, sometimes an NGO, has given you a solution that seemed cheap or profitable, that served lots of needs with the effort of a few human beings. I pity people who need to sell products to universities, governments, and multinational Fortune 500 companies, right? Because you're dealing with bureaucracy, and the kind of bureaucracy where there are many layers between the end user that organization is there to serve and the decision maker who's making the purchasing decision. Unfortunately, more and more, because there's no responsiveness pressure, those large organizations make their decisions not to delight their user, whether it's a purchaser of a good, an enjoyer of a service, someone getting housing or education, or you name it, right? Instead, they're making those decisions in order to lock you in as quickly as possible and rip as much money out of the system without investing in the future meeting of needs. Now, I say that in a very grand way, Chris, but in our book, we document this trend. And because that's happened right now, if you're selling into the large, you're dealing with those decision makers. You're dealing with, if I can put it very bluntly, decision makers out of touch with their end users. And so you're also up against typically a lot of market power, right? Where incumbent solutions being brought by the large are very hard for those decision makers to resist for a million reasons, from their capacity to take the buyer to lunch all the way through to their capacity to work with systems that require a lot of security or a lot of integration, to their ability to simply manage the bureaucratic purchasing process. So for a host of reasons we probably don't have time to get into, selling, I say a lot about, and we've done a lot in showing the power of enabling regular people to create their own experiments. But I want to caution folks that often the game there is not to try to simply directly take on the way things have been done in the past with something similar. Where that's really valuable is when there are unmet needs of end users and you can go more directly to them. It's very valuable. And those end users might be consumers, they might be small companies, it doesn't matter, right? But in that case, you can often create new markets. And let's not forget, this is not just some romanticizing that I'm doing. This is how it's always been done. Every wave of innovation has been created by those who made new markets. Think of even Silicon Valley itself. Think of those early computer hobbyists, right? Think of Steve Wozniak holding that first Mac. Whatever your image is that sets you on fire, and this isn't just in the early computer era, it has been about building, finding unmet needs or needs where folks are having to work around unresponsive systems and meeting them in ways that do delight them, that do take care of their specificity and that they can choose, and then that draw resources to that because folks are choosing it. There is lots of resistance to doing this, but let's not forget, when there's lots of resistance to meeting a need, the opportunities for the innovator aren't less. They're harder, but they're greater. They're harder because you have to deal with the incumbency advantages, all the things that I just glossed over, right? I just touched on. But then when you do find a better way, it's often possible. You often, and I can give you 1,000 examples of this, then the end user says, wait a minute, there's a whole different way of doing things, and the incumbents can really suffer. So, I mean, this is the history of innovation. It's always been this way. And so, look, I recognize that this is a hard pill to swallow if you're just trying to make your next quarter numbers, right? But Chris, since your audience involves folks who are actually trying to entrepreneur sustainability, it does change your calculus. You're not doing it in an industry where you have a very short period of time before you have to become profitable or have a huge market. And I'm well aware that many institutional investors, angel investor groups, venture capitalists are going to expect you to say huge market, very fast, etc. Right? But think about whether you can give yourself more leeway to experiment. And don't forget that the entrepreneurs you idealize, in many cases, they got to experiment, right? There are reasons that Tadashi and I called his autobiography, as I understand it in Japanese, 9 losses, 1 win, right? And there, if you even listen to the stories of some of the great entrepreneurs, and sometimes these stories are occluded, they're hidden, they're avoided because the business press wants to say that they started out with their brilliant thing, but it's about being able to learn what's going to work. That's what allows you to do something that really changes the game.
I'm interested in how you've managed to practically navigate that between the end user and the decision maker. How have you managed to get those decisions made for the end user?
Yeah. So first of all, this is an ongoing process for me, right? I'm living how that's not easy. I would say you've got to find people who really believe in your vision and are committed enough to it that they're, so I've been able to work with partners, investors, funders of our nonprofit, the Democratizing Innovation Institute, who believe in the vision more than any one iteration of it. They believe in the vision and the people. And because of that, we're in it to win it, Chris. Everyone has their own thing they want. But the kind of entrepreneurship that interests me is where you imagine the world working a certain way. You don't know how to get there, perhaps, or you think you do, and you're going to find out you don't. But you draw collaborators and funders and supporters to you who believe in that vision, and you're not done till you have achieved it. Now, that's how I operate. And you ask, well, how do you kind of deal with challenging situations that you run into? And I'll give you a great example. When we started RebelBase, our thought was that we were going to first hit the university market. And I had elaborate business plans about this, right? And we had 5 years mapped about how this is all going to work. And we were just going to sell in. And we got early evidence that users didn't just like this, they loved it. And by users, I mean folks using it for project-based learning, entrepreneurship, innovation, change-making projects, you name it, right? And so we were going to get a few of those delighted users, and then folks were going to buy in. Boy, was I wrong, right? I don't even try to approach universities directly. Now, what am I doing? I am actually building a network of people. I'm just using the wrong subject of that sentence. We are together. Folks who are very passionate about this are together. So that Democratizing Innovation Institute I mentioned isn't something that I was like. In fact, Tomas Mora said, we have to do this. And a few other people who were involved in those said, Sebastian Gross said, let's do it. And they're just two examples, Dalia Nashar, et cetera, et cetera. These folks said, we see the impact of this. We're going to build a network of people who are doing it. And I mentioned Nico de Klerk earlier. He brought it beyond universities, et cetera, et cetera. Mim and I will be in Albania in a few weeks, doing workshops for folks working to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem there. And that's because the lead there, his name is Alfred, sees the power of enabling people to create their own experiments, to create a vibrant and biodiverse innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem of their own. Make no mistake, if this sounds too idealistic, what I'm saying, this happens over and over in history, and this can happen in every part of the world. We are simply failing the test right now as an economy, right? Maybe we get a cool new gadget or a bauble we like. But if the test is a civilization where we're thriving, our kids and grandkids, or someone else's kids and grandkids, if you don't have kids, are thriving, well, heck, this is the test that we are failing by every indicator. And you don't have to look at too many projections to see that not in 50 years, but within this decade, we are heading toward places with probably more than hundreds of millions, probably billions of new refugees around the world. Those are the best estimates. Hosts of new diseases, elderly populations without recourse, more and more life in cattle class, from trying to go to the drugstore to trying to go to the bank, you name it. These are the places we're heading. And I say that dark stuff not partly just to be real. I mean, our book exhaustively, we made the book short to keep it affordable, demonstrates that. But we have the tools right here in our hands, at hand, to do something different. And it's that simple, to make it normal for regular people who look around them and say, this should just work differently. What if instead to take part in an experiment to create the alternative? That prospect will never go away. And you don't need to be in what the WEF calls it, the innovation-driven economy, to do that. We have that evidence. We've looked at it for over 5 years, and it is very clear that you build it by doing it.
Tell me about a time when someone used RebelBase to create impact in a way that surprised even you.
Let's take the even out, right? They're always surprising me because I don't know. I don't know. Even the problems they want to solve surprise me every day of the week, right? Because what do I know, right? I grew up in New York City, where we have the illusion that we know the world, and it is an illusion. There's so many examples, Chris. But actually, let me start with one that we feature in the book. So Shannon Gomez is the founder of a company called RindCo, based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So Bangladesh has huge water pollution problems, and I'm talking rampant diseases throughout the population and a lot of water. It's something 7 feet above sea level, if I can speak in feet. That in Bangladesh, the leather tanning process, the leather industry, garments are, I think, the biggest part of their economy, is one of the main causes of water pollution. So Shannon says, well, we have all this fruit peel around, right? Jackfruit, banana. There's a lot of peel that's just being discarded. It's waste. And she and her team, this was not her by herself, but the interview was with her, and she's a CEO. They say, Well, let's find out how this works. So they go into one of the leading leather producers in Bangladesh, and they tour and they talk to the CEO. They get an introduction. This is very important, by the way. This is part of the key point of the story is find out how it works now, right? And here's what they find out. This is mind blowing. They find out that, oh yeah, there's demand. That company has demand for plant-based leather solutions. But guess what? They import the plant-based leather from the Americas. I'm not making this up. And then they export it to customers in Europe and America. Like, that's really a big part of their business. Brilliant, right? And yet they have all this fruit peel. Shannon and her colleagues get to work. And the surprise here is really important. They've said that when they were doing the first version of their project, they were all students in various, she's a science student, and there was a tech student and this sort of thing in Dhaka. They had no idea that what they were developing anyone would care about, anyone would value. But then they proceeded to win a little competition that I helped create, and then another grant from a foundation, a big global apparel brands foundation, and then another one. And they said it surprised them that they could be the people coming up with the solution. And when I interviewed Shannon last in January of this year, she was busy doing the science to create the bonding agents to, like, not kidding around, right? And the point here is that this team, when they were voted number one by the global facilitators that year, they said that they didn't think it was possible that someone could have treated them as the people who could solve this problem. So just pause there. It's not just me who's being surprised. It's the people themselves who, of course, they have the solutions we need, but they don't know it. The key there is that we're measuring these things. So I talk about these surprising ideas. These are measurable things, right? And the big takeaway is that it is not the people sitting at Stanford or in New York, or those are just American examples, right? It is not those people who have the answers, because those people don't know enough about the problems. The surprise comes from the knowledge that Shannon has about the problems and the potential. And it is out of that knowledge of the need and the potential that the really interesting solutions come, the ones I couldn't conceive of given 1,000 years. So that's where it's at. And that, I believe, is really what gives us some potential, is enabling those people to create solutions and working with them, because they need our resources. They need your knowledge, your talent, your company's access to market, your capital, and so forth. So find them, work with them, and make sure they have the chance to create the experiments that do meet our need and do make sure that there's a tomorrow.
Final question for you is, if you had one piece of advice for another founder in sustainability, what would it be?
Give yourself more runway than you think. Whether you're a founder of a business or you're trying to entrepreneur within your organization, give yourself the chance to experiment. And the entrepreneurial case is important. I'll never forget a former MBA of mine called Alistair saying, we talked about creating a skunkworks strategy to make sustainability foremost in the major global consultancy where he was working with the energy practice. And so we talked about just doing it small till they needed it, and boy, did they end up needing it. So let's not forget that everything I'm about to say applies as much to entrepreneurs within organizations as to entrepreneurs. And one more note on that, when I talk about the failures of top-down, the problems of bureaucracies, within those bureaucracies is a good place to make that change. The biggest thing I'd say is give yourself the chance to do a bunch of experiments till you find something that really works. Just as Shannon's doing, give yourself the space, build the network, and take the time to experiment. Now, that's a really obvious point, right, to say. But most of us fail to do that. If I had a nickel for every talented innovator that closes off their window for experimentation for all the wrong reasons, how does we close it off? Some of it is we build too expensive a lifestyle, right? And boy, do they make it easy these days, right? If you're a young person and trying to afford rent, healthcare, and education, especially in the US with educational debt being what it is, it's very hard to maintain your flexibility. Maintain your flexibility, right? That will allow you to try to build something that you believe in rather than doing what most of us end up having to do, as we talk about in the book, which is in order to escape life in cattle class, you end up having to sign on to enable these decrepit incumbent models that you don't believe in the first place. Give yourself the chance, either within your organization, within your industry, or within your community, to create something you can believe in, because that's the whole freaking point of life, right? If you're doing something you don't believe in, then every day is a drag. But if you're doing something you do believe in, then it can be incredibly hard for incredibly long. But every day is a little bit of a thrill. Maybe not every day, but a lot of them. Recruit people who are truly committed to what you're doing, right? They're in it to win it. There's a place for hired guns. We need them. And of course, there's a place for people being able to make money. But money is not the main thing that drives solution creators. Never has been. When there's a lot of money, it's like rock and roll in the 80s. Suddenly it draws those people, right? And entrepreneurship has now drawn a lot of those people. But in the end, you want to surround yourself with people that are in it to create your solution, its impact, its value. And it's even more important than the runway idea. Like, the real kernel here is you want to bind around your experiments folks who are committed to the impact, to the vision of how the real world could work, in our terms, to your what if instead. And if you bind folks bringing talent, folks bringing access, folks bringing money, folks bringing advice, all the things you need, if you bind together people who don't really care about the current version of it you're doing. You notice when I talk about anything we're doing, I'm like, yeah, we're doing it this way right now. No, it's the bigger thing that you're building, that all those pieces are there to support, right? Same with your first customers. And if folks are all about that solution and what it means, then the solution can change. So it's more than just the time. It's more than just runway in the classical sense, though that's important. It's about that level of commitment, and then making sure that you don't quickly create these external draws, either the wrong kind of investors who bring lots of resources but shoehorn you into an agenda that was never your own. This happens constantly. Or your costs simply shorten your runway in the conventional sense, and you just don't have time to get where you're trying to go.
I really appreciate this conversation today. How can people get in touch with RebelBase, get involved?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So you can go to rebelbase.co, and it's spelled like a rebel, rebels at a base, REBELBASE.co, not .com. And you can browse projects without even logging in. There's a new thing that we're going to be doing. We're actually going to be piloting this in Tirana and then in Cape Town, where we're creating a set of instructional materials that are drawn from RebelBase that'll come out with the book, One Size Fits None, to give folks an easy entry point into doing this with your population, whether it's employees, students, community members, doesn't matter, right? We are also going to be spending a lot of time on the Democratizing Innovation Institute, right? Which is not institutionally connected with RebelBase, but often will work alongside tools providers, including RebelBase, to solve the problem that we've talked about in this episode. So that's democratizinginnovation.org. And frankly, if you want to see the people, so on my podcast, which you should always watch an episode of this one before you watch that one, but What If Instead has an interview every couple of weeks with either someone who's creating a solution, someone who's working with people to create solutions. I find their stories to be incredibly inspiring. And it is these stories that when you read the news and it seems like the clown car of evil, as Mim puts it, is running everything, read those stories, because there are people in every community who are creating solutions. Let us enable them to say, what if instead, and learn to create the world that we end up living and working in.
Thank you very much for today. It's been a great conversation.
What a pleasure. Thank you, Chris.